Every summer camps all have rules. Stay in your lodge after dark. Never wander into the woods alone. No swimming without a counselor. For most campers, those rules are easy to understand. They're there to keep everyone safe. But when registration opened for Black Pine Camp in Northern Oregon, every camper received one additional rule. It wasn't printed in the handbook. It wasn't mentioned on the website. Parents never heard about it. Only the campers did. Every Monday evening after dinner, the camp director gathered every new arrival around the main fire pit. He welcomed them to camp, introduced the counselors, explained the week's activities: archery, kayaking, night hikes, campfire songs. Then, just before dismissing everyone for the evening, his expression always changed. His smile disappeared. His voice became calm, almost rehearsed. He looked around the fire to make sure every camper was listening. Then he said the same sentence he had repeated every summer for nearly 40 years. If the campfire goes out after midnight, no matter what happens, do not light it again. No explanation. No warning. Just that. The counselors never laughed. None of them rolled their eyes. They simply nodded as if they had heard it 100 times before. Most of the campers exchanged confused looks. A few laughed quietly. Some whispered theories. Maybe it was part of an initiation. Maybe it was a ghost story adults told to keep kids from staying awake all night. By breakfast the next morning, almost everyone had forgotten about it. Everyone, except Cedar Lodge, which sat farther from the others than any building at Black Pine Camp. It wasn't abandoned. It wasn't run down. It simply happened to be the last cabin before the forest swallowed the rest of the camp. During the day, nobody thought much about it. At night, it felt isolated. The trees seemed closer. The silence lasted longer. Every sound carried farther. The lodge housed 8 campers between the ages of 16 and 17. By the third day, they'd become friends. There was Ethan, the unofficial class clown who never missed an opportunity to challenge a rule. Lena, who carried a camera everywhere and photographed everything. Marcus, who claimed he didn't believe in ghosts but refused to walk anywhere alone after sunset. The others were no different. They spent the afternoons swimming, hiking, and competing in archery tournaments before gathering around the enormous campfire every evening. The fire became the center of camp life. Stories were told there. Songs were sung there. Marshmallows burned there. By 11:30 each night, the counselors reminded everyone it was almost time for lights out. The campers slowly drifted back toward their lodges. Except for Cedar Lodge. They had discovered something. If they waited until everyone else left, they could stay behind for another 30 or 40 minutes before any counselor came looking. It became their secret tradition. Every night they sat around the dying fire talking about school, relationships, college plans, and the strange little rumors they'd heard about Black Pine Camp. One counselor in particular hated seeing them linger. His name was Daniel. He wasn't much older than the campers. Maybe 23. Unlike the others, Daniel never joked about the campfire rule. Whenever he walked past the fire and saw Cedar Lodge still sitting there, he always looked uneasy. One night, Ethan finally asked him, "Why can't we relight it?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stared into the flames until they settled lower. "You don't need to know. That's not an answer." "No, it isn't. So tell us." Daniel sighed. "I've worked here for 5 summers. So, I've seen people ignore that rule." Everyone leaned forward. "What happened?" Daniel looked toward the forest. For a long moment he didn't speak. Finally he shook his head. "I don't work after midnight anymore." That was all he said. Then he stood up, collected the empty mugs, and walked away without looking back. The campers laughed once he was out of earshot. Marcus rolled his eyes. "He's trying to scare us." Lena wasn't so sure. She had noticed something. Every counselor left the campfire before midnight. Not one of them ever stayed to make sure it burned out. It was almost as if they wanted to be as far away from it as possible. That observation sat quietly in the back of everyone's mind. Until Friday night, the hottest day of the summer. The driest evening they'd had all week. Nobody realized they were about to break the only rule that mattered. Because this time, the fire didn't die on its own. It was extinguished by the rain. The storm arrived without warning. One moment the campers were laughing around glowing embers. The next, a cold wind swept through the clearing hard enough to send sparks spinning into the darkness. The trees began to sway. Branches groaned overhead. A distant roll of thunder echoed somewhere beyond the hills. "Looks like we're done for tonight," Marcus muttered. Rain fell a few seconds later. At first it was little more than a drizzle. Then it became a downpour. The remaining counselors hurried everyone toward the cabins. Within minutes the clearing was empty, or almost empty. Cedar Lodge stopped halfway back. Ethan turned and looked over his shoulder. The campfire hissed as rain hammered the dying coals. Orange light faded beneath a blanket of steam. The darkness. For a moment nobody moved. Lena looked back toward the empty fire pit. You remember the rule? Ethan laughed. You mean the world's dumbest camp rule? Marcus shrugged. It is just a fire. Nobody answered. The rain continued to fall. Finally Ethan smiled. I'll be right back. Before anyone could stop him, he sprinted across the clearing. The others watched him disappear into the equipment shed. 30 seconds later he emerged carrying a bundle of dry kindling and a small can of fire starter. Oh, come on, Lena called. Ethan. He ignored her. Within moments he had stacked fresh wood over the soaked logs. One match. Nothing. The second. Nothing. The third match caught. A tiny flame appeared beneath the kindling. The others instinctively stepped closer. The little fire struggled against the rain. Then, almost impossibly, it began to grow. Orange, yellow, gold. Within minutes the campfire was burning brighter than it had all evening. The rain hadn't stopped. The wood was still soaked. None of it should have been burning. Marcus frowned. How is it doing that? No one had an answer. The 7 campers pulled their chairs back into a circle. Someone produced a fresh bag of marshmallows. Someone else found a deck of cards. Laughter slowly returned. For the next 20 minutes, everything felt completely normal. The storm drifted farther into the mountains. The rain became lighter. The fire burned hotter. Nobody noticed the 8th chair. It had been empty all evening. Now someone was sitting in it. Not one person remembered hearing footsteps. Not one person remembered seeing anyone arrive. The conversation continued naturally. The stranger laughed when everyone laughed, smiled at the right moments, even nodded during stories. It wasn't until Lena lifted her camera to take another photograph that she hesitated. She lowered it again. Who are you? Silence settled over the circle. Every face slowly turned toward the 8th chair. The young man sitting there looked to be about 17. Dark hair, gray hoodie, mud on his hiking boots. He looked perfectly ordinary. The strange part was that nobody recognized him. Not from any of the lodges. Not anywhere in camp. He looked around the circle with a puzzled expression. I thought, he said quietly. You invited me. No one spoke. The fire crackled between them. The stranger looked around the circle, clearly confused by their expressions. What? Ethan forced a laugh. Sorry, we're just trying to remember which lodge you're in. The boy smiled. Hemlock Lodge. Silence. Marcus frowned. There isn't a Hemlock Lodge. The stranger chuckled as if Marcus were joking. Sure there is. He pointed toward the forest. Just past yours. Every camper turned instinctively. Beyond Cedar Lodge, there was nothing. Only towering pines disappearing into darkness. When they looked back, the stranger was still smiling. You guys seriously don't remember meeting me? Lena slowly shook her head. No. I've been sitting here almost half an hour. Nobody argued. Because that was impossible. They would have seen him arrive. They would have heard footsteps across the gravel. Someone would have offered him a chair. Instead, every single person around the fire had the same unsettling realization. None of them could remember when the 8th chair stopped being empty. Trying to ease the tension, Ethan introduced himself. I'm Ethan. The stranger smiled warmly. I know. He looked around the circle. Lena, Marcus, Sophie, Caleb, one by one. He said every name correctly. Nobody had introduced themselves. Lena's stomach tightened. How do you know our names? The stranger looked genuinely surprised. You told me. No, Marcus replied. We didn't. For the first time. The smile disappeared from the stranger's face. He stared into the flames. That's strange. The wind shifted. Somewhere in the forest, a whistle echoed through the trees. Long and low, almost melodic. The stranger froze. His eyes locked onto the darkness beyond the firelight. His face drained of color. We should put it out. Nobody moved. The fire, he whispered. We need to put it out. Ethan laughed nervously. A few minutes ago you wanted to sit with us. I know. Then what's the problem? The stranger stood so quickly his chair toppled backward. His breathing became shallow. It's still awake. What is? He looked toward the trees again. When he answered, his voice barely rose above a whisper. The reason they told you never to light it again. The whistle came a second time. Closer. Much closer. Not from deep within the forest anymore. From somewhere. Just beyond the edge of the firelight. Then another whistle answered. Behind them. Marcus slowly turned. Nothing. Only darkness. Only trees. Only the beam of moonlight filtering through moving branches. When he faced the fire again, the stranger was gone. His chair still rocked gently. Warm as though someone had just stood up. No footsteps. No running. No sound at all. Only Cedar Lodge remained around the fire. And every one of them realized the same horrifying thing. No one had seen him leave, just as no one had seen him arrive. Nobody moved. For several long seconds, the 7 campers simply stared at the empty chair. Marcus was the first to speak. Did he seriously just leave? Lena stood slowly. I never heard him walk away. Neither had anyone else. The only sounds were the fire crackling and the wind whispering through the pine trees. Ethan stepped toward the edge of the clearing. Hello? No answer. He shined his flashlight into the forest. Towering pines. Thick undergrowth. Nothing else. The stranger had vanished. He's messing with us, Ethan muttered, though his voice carried far less confidence than before. Marcus bent down and picked up the overturned chair. It was still warm. He was sitting here. Nobody argued. Lena suddenly remembered the camera hanging around her neck. I took pictures. Her hands shook as she scrolled through the images. The first showed the 7 campers laughing around the fire. The second, and her heart stopped. There were 8. The stranger sat between Ethan and Sophie, smiling toward the flames exactly as everyone remembered. The third photograph made Lena drop the camera. What? Marcus picked it up. The stranger was gone. The chair remained. But something else had appeared. Standing just beyond the firelight, among the trees, were silhouettes. Not one, not 2. Dozens. Human-shaped. Perfectly still. Watching. No faces. No movement. Only dark figures standing shoulder to shoulder between the trunks. Marcus looked up from the camera. The tree line was empty. Nothing stood there now. It has to be the lighting, Ethan said quickly. It has to. No one believed him. Then the fire popped loudly. A shower of sparks spiraled into the air. Every silhouette in the photograph had moved. Not in real life. Only in the next picture. One step closer. Another photograph. Closer again. Another. Closer. Every image Lena had accidentally captured while lowering the camera showed the same impossible thing. The figures advanced only when no one was looking. None of the campers noticed them in real time. Only the camera did. Marcus swallowed hard. Delete them. Lena couldn't. Her fingers wouldn't move. Then the oldest counselor in camp burst into the clearing. Daniel stopped the moment he saw the burning fire. His face turned pale. I told you. His voice broke. I told you never to light it. He grabbed a bucket from beside the woodpile and threw water across the flames. Steam exploded upward. The fire died instantly. For several seconds, nobody spoke. Daniel stared into the darkness surrounding the clearing. Then, to everyone's confusion, he counted. 1. He pointed toward Ethan. 2. Marcus. 3. Lena. One by one he counted every camper. When he reached 7, he finally closed his eyes in relief. Thank God. Ethan frowned. What are you doing? Daniel looked at the empty chair. I was counting you. The campers exchanged confused glances. What do you mean? Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. It always comes to the fire as 8. Silence. He looked at every one of them before continuing. And if I count 9. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Because every camper suddenly understood why the counselors always left before midnight. Why the rule had never been explained. And why no one, not a single person, was ever allowed to relight the campfire after it died. Some rules weren't made to protect people from making mistakes. They were made to stop something from being invited in. The incident at Black Pine Camp was never reported as anything unusual. No one died. No one disappeared. By sunrise, every camper was accounted for. The camp director called an emergency meeting that morning. Parents were told a severe storm had damaged several parts of the campground. The remaining activities were canceled. Within hours, buses were already taking campers home. Most of them assumed the adults were overreacting. Only the 7 campers from Cabin 7 knew what had happened around the fire. Even then, they struggled to explain it. When they tried describing the 8th camper, something strange happened. No one could agree on what he looked like. Ethan insisted he had dark hair. Marcus was certain it was blonde. Lena remembered green eyes. Sophie was convinced they were brown. The only detail every one of them agreed on was his smile. They all remembered the same calm expression, the same quiet voice, the same impossible feeling that they had known him for hours, even though none of them had ever met him before. The counselors interviewed everyone. Nothing came of it. There was no missing camper. No record of anyone ever staying at a non-existent Hemlock Lodge. The photographs Lena had taken that night became the only physical evidence the group still had. Most of them were ordinary. Campers laughing. Roasting marshmallows. Rain falling across the clearing. Then came the photograph with the stranger. Counselors examined it repeatedly. No signs of editing. No double exposure. No reflections. The image appeared authentic. Eventually the counselor returned the camera. The case quietly faded away. Years passed. The campers grew older. Some refused to talk about Black Pine ever again. Others convinced themselves exhaustion and fear had distorted their memories. Lena tried hardest of all to move on. She became a photojournalist. Traveled the world. Won awards. Yet one photograph stayed locked inside a box beneath her bed. She never showed it to anyone. Not until 23 years later. After her death, while clearing out her home, her daughter discovered the old camera, several developed prints, and a small envelope. Curious, Rebecca opened the envelope. Inside is one photograph. On the back, just 3 words. Never count twice. She laughs. Looks at the photograph. Counts the campers. 7. She glances away. Looks back and sees the smiling 8th camper. Today, Black Pine Camp is still open every summer. Children still gather around the same fire pit. Counselors still tell ghost stories beneath the stars. Most traditions have changed over the decades. But one rule has never been removed. It isn't written in any handbook. Parents are never told. Only the campers hear it. Always on the first night. Always spoken the same way. Always without explanation. If the campfire ever goes out after midnight, don't light it again. For nearly 3 decades, no one from Black Pine Camp agreed to discuss what happened that July. Former counselors declined interviews. Camp records from the early 1990s mysteriously disappeared. Local newspapers mentioned only a severe thunderstorm that forced the camp to close early. Nothing else. To anyone researching the camp years later, it looked like an ordinary weather evacuation. The only people who knew otherwise never spoke publicly. Until Daniel. By then he was 61 years old. His hair had turned completely gray. He lived alone in a small cabin nearly 200 miles from Black Pine. When investigative journalist Rebecca Shaw finally convinced him to sit down for an interview, she expected stories about frightened campers and exaggerated ghost tales. Instead, Daniel began with a question. Do you know why people have campfires? Rebecca smiled politely. For warmth. Daniel shook his head. No. To cook? Again he shook his head. The first campfires weren't built for warmth. They were built because people realized something. He looked out the rain-speckled window before finishing. Whatever lived in the darkness preferred circles. Rebecca frowned. I'm sorry? Daniel leaned forward. You've been told the campfire rule your entire life. But you've never asked the only question that matters. She waited. If relighting the fire was so dangerous, why was it safe to light it before midnight? Rebecca opened her notebook. She had never considered that. Daniel continued. Because before midnight, the circle is complete. What circle? The people around the fire. Rebecca's pen stopped moving. Daniel spoke carefully, choosing every word. Long before Black Pine Camp existed, travelers crossing those mountains noticed something strange. They'd gather around their campfire. They'd count 6 people. Then hours later, they'd count 7. Rebecca interrupted. Someone wandered into camp? Daniel looked at her. That's what they thought. They always believed they'd simply forgotten someone. Rebecca felt an uneasy knot forming in her stomach. Daniel continued. Until morning. What happened in the morning? They counted again. Rebecca whispered. And there were only 6. Daniel nodded. They never agreed on who had disappeared. They never remembered losing anyone. They only knew someone had been there the night before. Rebecca stared at him. That doesn't make any sense. No, it doesn't. And that's why people wrote rules instead of explanations. Daniel stood and walked toward an old wooden bookshelf. From the very top shelf, he removed a weathered leather journal. The cover had almost completely fallen apart. Its pages had turned the color of old parchment. He placed it gently on the table. This is why the rule exists. Rebecca carefully opened the first page. The journal wasn't from Black Pine Camp. It wasn't even from the 20th century. Written across the inside cover, in faded ink, were the words, July 18, 1879. The journal belonged to a surveyor sent to map the forest decades before the camp was ever built. Rebecca flipped through page after page describing rivers, wildlife, mountain passes. Then one paragraph stopped her cold. It had been underlined 3 separate times. Tonight we counted 9 men around the fire. This morning we counted 8. No one remembers the 9th. Yet an empty bedroll remains beside the ashes. Rebecca looked up. This is real. Daniel nodded slowly. There were 12 journals. Rebecca blinked. 12? We only found 11. What happened to the last one? Daniel's eyes drifted toward the window. No one remembers who was carrying it. Silence settled over the room. For the first time since the interview began, Rebecca noticed something. Daniel had placed 2 mugs of coffee on the table. She had only seen him pour one. The second mug was still warm. She looked around the cabin. There was no one else there. Daniel followed her gaze. His expression changed instantly. Without saying a word, he reached over, picked up the untouched mug, walked outside, and quietly poured it into the dirt. When he returned, he locked the front door, then every window. Only then did he sit back down. Rebecca finally asked the question she had been avoiding. Daniel? What exactly came to that campfire? Daniel didn't answer immediately. Instead, he whispered the same sentence he had repeated to campers for 40 years. If you remember inviting it, it isn't the one you should fear. Rebecca stared at him. What does that mean? Daniel's eyes filled with something Rebecca couldn't identify. It wasn't fear. It wasn't grief. It was recognition. Very softly, almost too softly to hear, he said, the dangerous one is the one everyone forgets. Rebecca ended the interview an hour later. She packed away her recorder, closed her notebook, thanked Daniel for his time. As she reached the front door, she stopped. Something felt wrong. She looked back across the room. Daniel? He looked up. How many people have been in this cabin since I arrived? Daniel didn't answer. Rebecca frowned. She glanced toward the 2 armchairs beside the fireplace. I could have sworn. Her sentence faded away. She couldn't remember. For a brief second, she was certain someone else had been sitting there. A man, older, quiet, listening. But the memory dissolved almost as quickly as it appeared. Daniel's face changed. Very slowly, he stood. His voice was calm. Don't try to remember. Rebecca laughed nervously. Remember what? The person you think you're forgetting. Silence. You'll convince yourself you're imagining things. He walked toward the fireplace. The journals all say the same thing. They didn't lose people. They lost certainty. Rebecca stared at him. Daniel continued. That's why no one could ever describe the 8th camper. Memory repairs itself. It fills empty spaces. It protects you. He looked directly into her eyes. But sometimes, it repairs them incorrectly. Rebecca left without another word. She drove for nearly an hour before realizing something strange. Her audio recorder was still running. Curious, she pressed play. The interview sounded exactly as she remembered. Her questions. Daniel's answers. The rain striking the roof. The crackling fireplace. Then near the very end, a voice interrupted. Not Daniel's. Not hers. A third voice. Clearer this time. She remembered me. Rebecca slammed the brakes. The recorder slipped onto the passenger seat. She replayed the audio. Nothing. Only silence. She listened again. Still nothing. The voice had vanished. She eventually convinced herself she had imagined it. That's what she wrote in her notes. That's what she told her editor. That's what appeared in the documentary. The interview aired 6 months later. Millions watched it. Most dismissed it as an entertaining camp legend. Others became fascinated with the old journals, the photographs, the impossible recordings. Black Pine Camp quickly became the subject of online discussions, paranormal investigations, and amateur documentaries. People wanted answers. No one found any. 3 weeks after the documentary aired, Rebecca received a plain brown envelope with no return address. Inside was a single photograph. It showed the original campers from Cabin 7 standing around the fire. 7 faces looked toward the camera. She had seen it before. Then she noticed something. written carefully across the bottom edge of the photograph. In handwriting she recognized as Daniel's, were 8 names, not 7. Rebecca read them twice, 3 times. She knew every camper's name from the case. Ethan, Lena, Marcus, Sophie, Caleb, Ryan, Noah. Then the 8th. A name she'd never heard before. She looked back at the photograph. Suddenly, she couldn't remember which face belonged to that name. She counted again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 smiling teenagers stood around the fire. Had there always been 8? Rebecca reached for her phone to call Daniel. The number had been disconnected. She contacted the local sheriff. They searched the property where Daniel had lived. The cabin was empty. Dust covered every room. The power had been disconnected years earlier. Neighbors insisted no one had lived there in almost a decade. But I interviewed him. Rebecca argued. The sheriff only looked confused. Interviewed who? She opened her bag, pulled out her notebook. Every page from the interview was blank. Only one sentence remained, written across the final page. Not in her handwriting. Not Daniel's. Just 6 words. The fire only counts once. Years have passed since Rebecca tried to uncover the truth behind Black Pine Camp. The documentary still exists. The photographs still exist. The rules still exist. Every summer, new campers gather around the same fire. Most laugh when the counselors repeat the old warning. Most believe it's just another ghost story. Maybe they're right. Or maybe, one night, you'll find yourself sitting around a campfire with friends. You'll count everyone once, then count again. And for the briefest moment, you'll wonder why you're absolutely certain there were fewer people a second ago. If that ever happens, don't ask questions. Don't count again. And whatever you do, if the fire dies after midnight, don't light it again.